article I don't know too much about, but
basically there's an article written by Alison Rudd on the Times. Article's been going viral yesterday on Tottenham Twitter. It set Tottenham Twitter ablaze when it was posted. The title of this article is called "Thomas Frank should be the most in-demand manager in football." And we're just going to go through it because I think there are some. It's just she sums up his time at Tottenham quite incredibly, I think. And I want to get your reaction to it, and I want to hear what the fans think of it, because I think it's baffling the way she talks about it. Do you think
this article was made to rage bait us Spurs fans?
Maybe. But apparently she does have just something against Tottenham. That's what people say. I don't know. I don't know who she is. But I want to just read some of the most important points. It says, the most desirably horrible coach in the world right now, ? It has to be Thomas Frank. Think back to when he was appointed by Tottenham. The only criticism of his move from Brentford was the Dane had no big club experience, that life had been sweet and organised and contained in West London, and that the media spotlight of being in charge of Spurs would be a shock to his system and that one might struggle with him. Well, now we all know about the things that were alien to him. He understands that fan bases can be entitled and cruel and impatient, that not all clubs are run as a streamlined and sustainable model like Brentford, that having 11 senior players injured does not give you license to play defensively in the hope of securing a few precious points, that being realistic and pragmatic can be misinterpreted as lacking in imagination.
That is such rubbish. What is she talking about? 11 first-team injuries get you...
Does not. She's saying what we learnt was that apparently 11 injured players doesn't give you the licence to play defensively.
Well, he hasn't had 11 injured players from the start of the season. Like, literally, we've been playing this dross football all season. Even from the start, like, the injuries came a bit later. What about before the injuries? You're not gonna take that into account.
Literally from the first game, he was playing defensively. Like, yes, we were getting some results, but he was still playing defensively. And then the results.
We tried to play on the counter attack against Burnley first game of the season, and we won 3-0.
Yeah,
but it wasn't the greatest game, was it?
No. She also says he understands now that fan bases can be entitled and cruel and impatient. Calling out the fans for being entitled, cruel and impatient.
What are we entitled about? We just don't want to be in a relegation battle. That's when it started getting toxic, when we were getting close to the relegation zone.
And I don't think we're entitled for not liking what we're seeing. Forget it. Also, that's obviously for sure in a relegation zone. If we weren't in that relegation zone, would we be as frustrated and impatient as we are? No. But being in a relegation battle coupled with the god-awful football is I think Tottenham have been probably more patient than they should have been. It's been terrible. She says that being realistic and pragmatic can be misinterpreted as lacking in imagination. That's so his football is just that he was just realistic and pragmatic. That was what his football was.
I think she's having us on, this woman.
No, I think
whoever she is. I really think she's having us on. This is rage bait at its finest.
She goes on to say, in the coming weeks, Frank will excel and assess his 8 months at Tottenham head coach and maybe even smile ruefully, because many of his doubters, before he had even crossed the North Circular, wondered if he could possibly know how to navigate the Champions League, having had no experience of European competition. And yet the fact he left Spurs with the club above Madrid, Barca and Man City in the final standings in a very solid 4th spot was entirely overlooked by his detractors. There was the UEFA Super Cup final against the mighty PSG, which Tottenham lost only on penalties, in which Spurs played some entertaining football, but no one mentions that either, unless trying to claim all Frank's European exploits were somehow accidental.
Look, I've said about last year's Europa League that it was great to win it. It was unbelievable, one of the best nights of my life that night in Bilbao. But actually, when you look at it, who did we actually play from the group stages all the way to the final? You know, we played pretty much nobody of note up until the Frankfurt game. Frankfurt was probably the hardest team that we played in the whole tournament, in my opinion. So the same has got to be said to judge Thomas Frank in terms of that was the most easiest Champions League group campaign that anyone could have hoped for.
Yeah, and I
about Copenhagen, Slavia Prague, Bodø Glimt.
We played 4 of the bottom 6.
Exactly.
So, there you go. But I think it's the thing. it's one thing finishing fourth in a table, in a group stage, but it doesn't mean anything. I understand he never got the chance to finish the job because he got sacked, but finishing fourth in a Champions League table does not mean anything. It's not an achievement. It's not like finishing fourth in the Premier League because you get Champions League, whatever. Finishing fourth gets you nothing. Yes, it gets you top end. You missed the punishment round, but it doesn't mean anything. We won a trophy last season. That means something. I understand you can sell whatever you want about who we played and whatever, but we went through all the rounds and we actually lifted the trophy. That is what we got. It's very different to finishing fourth in a Champions League qualifying group stage.
But the level of team has to be taken into account, who we played in this Champions League group phase.
And that as well.
It has to be. Like, look at the 4 wins. We had 4 wins, right? In the Champions League group phase.
5. We beat Dortmund as well.
All right, fine. Dortmund was very impressive the way we beat them, but they were down to 10 men after, a half an hour, 20 minutes. We beat Copenhagen, we beat Slavia Prague, we beat Villarreal in like the most stodgiest game.
One with the early own goal.
And that was it. And Borussia Dortmund, and who was the other
Frankfurt.
win? And Frankfurt. Frankfurt
was out.
Frankfurt was still a decent win going away to Frankfurt, but
they also finished near the bottom.
Yeah, it's true. But I mean, those 5 wins don't smack like, oh wow, what a team, what a manager we have here. You know what I mean? They're teams we should be beating.
And Boda, we should have lost by a lot. We got lucky. Monaco, we were lucky to not lose that game by 3 goals. So, like, fine, he won those games, and fair enough.
That Champions League group phase papered over so many cracks in terms of his management.
But she's claiming it's overlooked by his detractors.
That's
madness.
Absolute nonsense.
And also, she goes on to say that, the PSG game, and that was evidence that he can play entertaining football. We scored with 2 set pieces. Don't get me wrong, I was entertained by the fact we were competitive against a good PSG team who I expected us to get battered by. However, in hindsight, they had no preseason. They were clearly off it. They clearly were not at their best. There was an opportunity to get at them in that game. We did score from just 2 set pieces and barely created anything else. And
we did look we looked threatening though. We did look threatening.
Did we have any chance apart from the 2 set pieces?
No, it's not. I think we looked threatening without having the chances, and it was his first game as Spurs boss.
I'm not criticising him. I'm just battling against the narrative that was proof that he could play entertaining football that game.
No. And we never saw anything of that ilk again throughout his tenure. I know we had two good games against PSG this season.
Yeah.
So that's got to work in his favour, because I think he managed 2 good games against PSG in the group phase, but we won neither of them.
No.
We drew the first one, going 2-0 up in the last 5 minutes. And the second one, he came up with a decent tactical plan for that game, but we conceded 5 goals, or 4, was it 4 or 5?
5-3.
So I was actually happy at the end of that PSG game when we conceded 5, because I thought, this could be a sign of us turning the corner, but it wasn't.
She goes on to say there was a good deal of snootiness about Frank's lack of glittering CV. He loved coaching, but okay, forget this paragraph because it's just about his old stuff, what he's done. His story is sought that Americans love, the self-made man who battled on because he knew he can make a difference. But we often offer less love to such characters. I don't think that's true, but anyway. Much has been made of the Spurs players finding him negative or distant, but they probably disliked more the fact that life was relaxed under Postecoglou and Frank made them work. If Frank pushed them, it was because they needed to be pushed. After all, the Dane put a piano in the players' lounge at Brentford's training ground because Mbeumo liked to practice on it. That hardly supports the notion of Frank as a distant and overly demanding figure. He was looking for players who wanted to work for him and instead found them hankering instead for a life less organised.
Yeah, I don't know what to say about that moment, because it's hard to make a full judgment on it when we don't know about relationships behind the scenes and we don't see what he's like on the training pitch with his players on a one-to-one basis. I mean, that is very much about the inner workings of a dressing room and the training ground. It's hard to make a real judgment on it.
Yeah, but she's saying they didn't like Frank because he made them work and it was relaxed under Ange.
Yeah, I mean,
what is this nonsense? She says Frank putting a piano in the training ground is evidence of how he's not such an overly demanding figure.
I think what this is a PR push.
It's a massive puff piece on him.
This is a PR push from Frank's team saying, come on, get us into work quickly?
I think some of this stuff is absolutely baffling. Frank inherited a team that had finished 17th and needed fixing. He therefore worked diligently to that end, but the fans were not much interested in hard work that looked like hard work. They wanted magical dust. They wanted Frank to be a saviour while doing all the furious paddling under the water, unseen, while making jokes and neglecting the importance of set pieces.
What is this rubbish? Seriously.
So Tottenham fans weren't interested in the work that Frank had to do unless it was magic dust.
It's nonsense.
She said we liked
nonsense.
Ange because he made jokes and neglected set pieces. That's what we wanted.
We saw a guy that had no tactical awareness about his play in terms of being at a so-called Big Six club.
He didn't have a way of playing on the ball. It's just that simple. We had no plan A. People say Ange didn't have a plan B, but Frank literally didn't have a plan A.
He did.
That was the problem.
He did have a plan A. His plan
Not on the
A.
ball.
His plan A was, under no circumstances, pass it forward in the midfield. Whatever you do, get the ball to Kudus, and let's try turn him into Messi. Take around everyone on the pitch and spam crosses into the box. And if if he's injured, let's try get Spence to take on everyone, or let's get just Porro in that position where he can constantly spam crosses in the box. That's all it was.
He had no possession-based way of playing, to control games. We just didn't know how to control games.
He doesn't care
in
about
possession.
control.
He doesn't compare about that. Yeah, he doesn't care about that. That was his big issue. When you're a big team, you've got to have an in-possession way of playing to control games. That's how most teams get their joy and win games. Even people who accuse Arsenal or whatever they want to accuse them of, they dominate possession, they pen teams in. That's what they do. Yes, they rely on set pieces, which maybe goes to a problem they have in breaking teams down. But that's not intent. That's not due to intent. They intend to. They just maybe don't. Whether they don't have the quality or whatever, but their intent is we're going to dominate you, we're going to suffocate you, and yes, if we need to break you down with a set piece, so be it. But we control the game. That's not Thomas Frank. Thomas Frank is we're gonna get the ball. We're gonna try and either win a set piece or get a cross in. That we have no kind of ambition to control the game. That is what I've seen from Thomas Frank. There was a keenness to pigeonhole Frank as a coach who demands physicality and pressing, and yet he was famous in his home country for tiki-taka possession. We see this version we expect to see rather than what is on show. When circumstances allowed, Spurs could be very fun to watch. It's just that the circumstances were not favourable all that often.
The only circumstances that Spurs were fun to watch in is when we played teams very much inferior to us, like the Slavia Pragues and the Copenhagens. That was the only time we were fun to watch.
Even in those games, I would argue we weren't. I would say Copenhagen, maybe Slavia wasn't that fun to watch.
Yeah, Copenhagen was.
Even if you remember those games, how did we score our goals? Copenhagen had to give us an open goal for the opening goal. Slavia, was it 2 penalties and an own goal?
Yeah, but still, in the Copenhagen game, we created many chances that day, and we kind of penned them in and suffocated them. We did. No matter how the goals came, that's what happened in that game. The same against Brentford in the Premier League. We were fun to watch that day. We battered them that day, and we created multiple chances. But you can literally count these games on one hand. That's the problem.
Yeah, and I don't think she can argue that the circumstances were not favourable that often. That often is what she's saying. No. It's absolutely madness what she's arguing. I remember there were points, and I understand he's had injuries, but I remember there were points in the season where we were getting the injury list down. I remember we were saying here on predict lineups, there's only a couple now. So I understand a large part of this for a large part of the season there have been injuries, but to the level of injury in terms of what he's had on the pitch to play with, he's had more than enough to have a game plan which is much more adventurous than he's shown.
As like we said, he had more than Pochettino in his first season.
Exactly. And then the last couple paragraphs, he is as far from being stuck in the mud as it is possible to get. When PSG won the Champions League by closing down the opposition at goal kicks, he must have raised an eyebrow, as this was already one of his tactics. Frank is innovative, and in a world where football veers back to the future and from side to side, his vision and attention to detail is all the more valuable. So wait, she is claiming that closing down the opposition at goal kicks is a Thomas Frank tactic. What is she on about?
I'll say there have been times where we've been decent and won the ball back high up the pitch and created goals and chances from it, but we've never been able to sustain that. That's the reality. And I genuinely believe what this is a play to say, you know what, they didn't value me there. I'm still a good manager. I want to be hired in a Premier League job again. This is all this is.
In the end, his time with Spurs was a marriage made in hell. He sums himself up as emotional and passionate and in need of a stable and calm club. That is why it was so beautiful at Brentford. Tottenham will have taught him what he already knew deep down, that not all clubs are patient or realistic.
I agree there. That's the one right thing that she said. It was a marriage made in hell.
That bit I agree. I just disagree with the fact that, look, if he had us in 7th and we panicked and sacked him because we weren't 4th, I would understand what she said, even if we had us in 10th. But the reality is he has us in 16th in a relegation battle. So the claim that we are just not patient or realistic, that's the issue here, I think is crazy. The fact is we stuck with Aaron stuff throughout the whole last season while we were down the bottom. So we did stick with that. I know we sacked him in the end, but we didn't sack him during the season. So in terms of us being patient or realistic, I don't think that was the issue. That might be true, but I don't think that was the issue.
The thing is, right, with Thomas Frank, I don't sit here and think he's a terrible manager, albeit he didn't show much of him being a good manager while he was here. I just don't think it was the right fit. I'm no under illusion that he can go to a Crystal Palace, that he can go to a team like that in the bottom half of the Premier League and probably do a decent job and get them potentially in the lower half or the top half or whatever. But he's not a manager for a top 6 club. He's not a manager for a club that are trying to get Champions League football or even Europa League football. He can overperform with a Brentford or a Crystal Palace or a team like that. I've got no doubt about it. But he's never going to work at a top club. He's just not.
His football doesn't scale up. And I think we were kind of... Tottenham were guilty of thinking because he overperformed with Brentford, that means he can just scale up his football and he can overperform with Tottenham on a lower wage budget. It's not how it worked. And if you looked at his football, it is not football of a team looking to be playing in the Champions League or looking to dominate the opposition and win games more often. He always leads games in the balance. It's very pragmatic. There's no set way of playing in possession. The team are very much restricted in what they can do. They're much more focused on the opposition and not focused on what they can do of themselves. And that is his football. And that's no way of managing a club of the size of Tottenham Hotspur. And I think we made that big mistake. And I think, to be honest, I think if there was anyone in that boardroom watching his football and actually analysing it, they could have come to that conclusion. But unfortunately, they're not looking at the right things. They're looking at just purely results and the amount of goals Brentford scored and how he overperformed his wage budget and all this kind of stuff. But those aren't the right things to look at when giving someone the job. You have to look at exactly what kind of football he likes to play, what his mentality is, and whether they can scale to a club like Tottenham. And we neglected that, I think.
Look, I think there's a lot of similarities to Spurs' Nuno appointment, to Spurs' Frank's appointment. You know, Nuno, off the back of, decent jobs at Wolves and stuff like that, and shows he can be a good manager in the Premier League. But he came to Tottenham and he showed he lacked any sort of way to create chances in an in-game model. And it's exactly the same with Thomas Frank. Like, how many times will we be sitting here throughout the season this year so far being like, this is just so similar to Nuno.
Yeah.
Looking at the metrics, looking at the numbers behind what we're trying to do. It's just like there's too many similarities here. And look, even I was saying that, but I was saying still give him time. I think he can turn it around. Obviously that wasn't that never happened and he's gone now. But Nuno is not a bad manager. Nuno's a good manager in his own right. But Nuno's not a manager for a top 6 club. And that's exactly the same.
Yeah. Last paragraph says, I will not dare to argue it could have ended happily in North London. The fans simply did not take to him, and every dropped point stoked their antipathy. But supporters of his next relatively calm club will have many reasons to be cheerful.
Yeah, they will if it's a Crystal Palace.
Depends who it is, yeah.
But if he goes to Chelsea, then he's going to be out the door quicker than anything.
But also, is there a case to say, when it comes to Brentford, like, there is something there where the manager doesn't seem to be that important. It's not the most important thing. And I've heard Brentford fans talk about this, where each manager comes into the Brentford system, does really well, gets them promoted or gets them performing really well, and then thinks they're too big for Brentford because of how well they've done, and they go on to new jobs and don't do very well because actually they didn't realise how they were being supported by the structure of Brentford rather than their own quality. And maybe the same is happening for Frank.
Yeah.
And as much as he did brilliant in Brentford, you've got to look at maybe it's had more to do with Brentford than Frank. Maybe that is the case. And at the moment, the evidence suggests it was.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's like you change the whole structure there of all the coaches, all the top players, and the manager, and they just keep getting better. And it's happened so many times with Brentford. This isn't like the first example of it.
No.
It's happened time and time again.
Every manager happens with.
So, yeah, there's a massive case for it. But look, like I said, I don't think Frank is a bad manager. I think he can still do well in the Premier League, but not at the top level.
Well, that is her article. Is Thomas Frank the most... Well, Thomas Frank should be. It wasn't even a question. It says Thomas Frank should be the most in-demand manager in football. Also,
I want to know how much Frank and his agent paid her to write that.
It was also juxtaposed, by the way, a year ago in in December 2014, when I think we had just lost 4-3 to Chelsea. She wrote an article about Tottenham, about Ange, saying Ange is a cult leader who is turning Spurs into a parody account. That was her title for that article. And then a year later, she's talking about how even though Frank failed more miserably than Ange, by the way, had worse points total at this stage, says Thomas Frank should be the most in-demand manager in football.
When she wrote that Ange is a cult leader thing, that's more evidence that she's on the Frank payroll because Frank wanted the job.
Exactly. This Alison Rudd, I don't know how many more articles I'll be reading of yours in the future. That was absolutely atrocious.
She's on Frank's payroll. That's the only explanation here.
Someone check the bank account. There's some insider stuff going on there.
Yeah, 100%. Some foul play here in the media. But look, I think that is it from us today.